In this section, we'll look at the cultural impact of the baby boom generation, and as it began to grow, it continued to have a profound impact at every stage of its development. For example, one of the most best-selling books of the 1950s was Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care. Dr. Spock argued that the very strict feeding and regimentation that was common among parents was actually not productive, and he said you just need to show a lot of love and give a lot of attention. You didn't need to be on a rigid schedule of feeding, and too protective a parent could actually hurt the child, Dr. Spock said. But the fact that this book was so well sold shows you that a lot of parents had kids. With a lot of parents having kids, what you're going to see in the 1950s is the beginning of disposable diapers, and the bestseller was pre-made formula. The toy industry, of course, exploded in the 1950s with the growth of large companies like Hasbro and Fisher-Price and Mattel. You see, with the widespread use of plastic, the popularity of little plastic soldiers, and airplanes were popular toys in the 1950s given the growth of aviation. You see toys that are still around today, like the beginning of Play-Doh and Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head. With all the children growing up, you see popular cartoons on weekend mornings. Things like Tom and Jerry and Popeye, some of the classics. Looney Tunes, which had extended all the way back to the 1930s, had characters like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Tweety and Sylvester and the Roadrunner and Pepe Le Pew. But these cartoons were quite popular for the kids in the morning. For girls, the new toy was the Barbie doll toy, which was first invented by a woman named Ruth Handler in 1959, and she got the idea from looking at a German doll she saw. As some of the baby boomers began to get old, you see games like Scrabble becoming very, very popular. Scrabble was first patented in 1948, but a version of the game went back before that, but it was a very popular game in the 1950s. As the kids got older, you began to see new TV shows like Captain Kangaroo and Walt Disney's Mickey Mouse Club, where they would sing MICKEYMOUSE, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. All right, I can't sing it. But it made real popular Mickey Mouse hats. A popular situation comedy, a sitcom in the 1950s, was Dennis the Menace, and that again was sort of a play off Leave It to Beaver, and it was popular among children watching TV. In 1954, Walt Disney launched the TV show Davy Crockett, and that was very, very popular, starring Fess Parker, and it led to a craze of children wanting coonskin caps, which of course Walt Disney provided them. As the 50s went along and the baby boom got older, they began to go to movies, and you see movies aimed at that demographic, like Godzilla and Creature from the Black Lagoon. Of course, as the older baby boomers got into the late 50s, they began to listen to music, and there was an explosion in the music industry, records and whatnot, and the beginning of what we now call rock and roll and rock. The phrase rock and roll went back to a disc jockey named Alan Freed, who was known on air as Moondog, and he began to play a lot of rhythm and blues music. Sometimes he'd get some rockabilly and country mixed in. But he said famously one time, "They're really rocking and rolling tonight," and that brought in the phrase rock and roll and ultimately rock. Freed went into try to go into television and films, and ultimately his career kind of ended in scandal when it became apparent that he was receiving payments from record companies to play their records. The new rock and roll certainly made famous some African American singers like Fats Domino, who sang Blueberry Hill and Ain't That a Shame, and Little Richard on the piano, who played hits like Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally and Lucille and Good Golly Miss Molly. Rock and roll was picked up by more than just the African Americans, and the big audience was, of course, white kids. There were stars like J.P. Richardson, who took the name the Big Bopper, and he did a lot of rockabilly style, but he had a hit with like Chantilly Lace. And there was Richie Valenzuela, who didn't want to go by his Hispanic name and shortened it to Richie Valens, and had a Latin-inspired hit, La Bamba. And of course, there was Buddy Holly from Lubbock, Texas. His group was called The Crickets, and they were reportedly the inspiration for the Beatles to take the word Beatles as their name. But he had hits like That'll Be the Day and Peggy Sue. On February 3rd, 1959, Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Richie Valens died in a plane crash shortly after the plane took off from Clear Lake, Iowa. And this was new, rock and roll was new, and these were stars, and they all were dead, and people said this was the day the music died. You may have heard that phrase because in 1971, a singer named Don McLean had a huge hit with the song American Pie, and in it he sings The Day the Music Died. Of course, the most famous star from the 1950s rock and roll was Elvis Presley. He was known as the King of Rock and Roll, or simply the King. He was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi, and his family moved to Tennessee when he was 13, and he had begun to be a truck driver. But his music career began in 1954 when he was recorded by the producer Sam Phillips at Sun Records in Memphis. And in time, Elvis had a number of hits with his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. His first real big hit was in 1956 with Heartbreak Hotel, but you see such hits as Blue Suede Shoes and Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel and Love Me Tender. He was wildly popular, and kids would go crazy at his concert, which was, again, unusual to that point. Presley was drafted into the military in 1958 and went, but he resumed his singing career when he returned 2 years later in 1960, and he continued to record music well into 1970s when he died in August 1977. He spent a lot of time in Las Vegas by that point. But in 1956, with his Elvis popularity, he quickly moved into film, and he had a number of film hits in the 1950s. 1956, Love Me Tender was first, but he did films like Jailhouse Rock and King Creole. His film career went well into the 1960s with things like Blue Hawaii. Presley made a number of appearances on the show The Ed Sullivan Show. It was one of the most popular shows of the 1950s, and a lot of new music and entertainment sort of got their first national exposure on it. It went from 1948 to 1971 and would go on every night from 8 to 9 p.m. every Sunday night from 8 to 9 p.m. A lot of acts got started on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Ed Sullivan Show had more of a variety of music and appealed to older folks. The young baby boomers also liked Dick Clark's American Bandstand, which ran from 1952 actually all the way through 1989, but its heyday was really in the 50s and early 60s. What Dick Clark would do is he'd play the latest records, and the baby boomers kids would dance, do things, dance, and he would interview them about their opinions about the song, and he'd have a Raider Records segment. But this was a very popular show in getting music exposed and selling records, of course. A singer called Chubby Checker did a cover of a song called The Twist, and it sort of helped contribute to a new dance craze of shaking called the Twist, which was the real rage of the baby boomers by the late 50s. The Twist and all the kids going crazy at the Elvis Presley concert sort of foretold the 1960s. As a matter of fact, Elvis would gyrate his hips and the crowd would go crazy. And a lot of the TV producers thought this was too risque, and so some stage famously he was shown only from the chest up. This includes a section on how the baby boomers changed American culture and society in the 1950s as they grew up.